Hello everybody, it's Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, and I wanted to share something kind of exciting with you. If you are using Cinema 4D R25, there is now a new tool for you to use that was built by Rocket Lasso. We are in between seasons 3 and 4 of Rocket Lasso Live, and during this break, we've been doing some consulting with Maxon for the purposes of giving our feedback on nodes, as well as attempting to learn them better and create some new tools. And one of my pitches for it was we were going to create some new spline primitives. And the first one that jumped to mind for something relatively simple, but something that I kind of reach for pretty often, is a grid spline. So let's show you how to get to it. Once again, this is only in Cinema 4D R25, but let's open up a brand new scene file and then move into the asset browser. Inside the asset browser, if this is in the first month that this comes out, which is in February of 22, I can click on new content. And inside of there, you can see a whole bunch of new assets that Maxon has provided. But what we created is this grid spline. There are also 4 different scene files that have material set up and some lighting, just some cool ways of using it. Let's talk about this tool. There are 2 different ways of using it. One would be to drag it into the actual scene nodes, but the other is to use it directly in the object manager as a regular spline. So dragging this over, you can see that instantly a new grid spline appears. Now, just for clarity, if you're using this sometime in the future, you can be selected on nothing, just search for the word grid, and there is grid right there, so you can pull that out. If you find you want to use this as a completely regular spline, something I suggest would be adding it to your palette of splines. So along those lines, I shall right-click on our splines here, say Customize Palette, right-click on it and say Unfold Palette, right here, Unfold. So that should pop it out, and now we can add additional ones into it. So let me add in the grid. And with the grid added, I can right click and again fold the palette so it collapses down small, and then drag that into the interface. And I think if we double click on that, yeah, it'll delete that first group. So now we've added in a brand new replacement on there. Let's close that. And you can see when you click on this drop down, that grid is just included in that collection. If you want to make that permanent, we should save the layout. So I'll turn off our asset browser, go to Window, Customization, and say Save as Startup Layout, which will just override the default one that opens up, which means it would always be inside of there. Having done that, let's take a look at some of the features directly inside of Grid. So once you've added it into your scene, this is just a Cinema 4D spline. So we can do things like feed this into a sweep, holding down Alt so it becomes a child of it, and then holding down Shift as I add a rectangle, and T for scale that down. And you can now see that I've created geometry directly from it. So we can just use this directly as a spline. Pulling it out, we don't need that right now. Let's look at some settings. We've got 3 different types of grid that you can generate. We can do the mode from per step and endpoint, much like the cloner. And then we've got the size, a gap, and then we can return the inside, outside, or the full shape, and you can reverse the spline. But there are a lot of combinations that do some pretty cool things here. And like I said, this is a tool that I've often found myself reaching for or rebuilding different versions of it. So here's just hopefully the ultimate version. Although if you have any feedback, we can always add that into a version 2.0. So if you have an idea, please leave a comment below. So let's just begin with our basic line. There are 2 main ways of thinking about grid. One would be 2-dimensionally, and that's whenever in the cells parameter, which is X, Y, Z. One way is if one of those is 0, which means it's a 2D grid. But we are not limited to that. We can make it a 3-dimensional grid. In this case, let's jump this up to 10 cells high, and now we get a full 3D grid. And there are different behaviors depending on if it's flat or if it's 3-dimensional. So let's just keep that in mind. Now we're able to set this to any number of subdivisions that we want. Let's jump to mode per step, just for some demonstration purposes. And there is now exactly 400 units between every cell. Every cell is 400. But that means I can add additional cells here, and you can see it'll slowly grow up, but each cell is 400. Unfortunately, right now we are not able to do an automatic conversion between per step and endpoint. Definitely something I want to be able to do in the future. Right now we are limited in not being able to do that. But let's continue taking a look at some of these things. So we can add as many cells as we want, going upward or back down to 0, making it 2-dimensional. We could say that that is 10 and this one's 0, so we can make a grid that is facing on X. Change the scale on any of these, change the height and the width. And in line mode, this is actually where it's least useful, but we have this gap. And if we start adding in a gap, you'll see that every one of these lines, and every one of these is a singular line, it'll scale down from the tip. So scaling down, and we get a gap from where they used to be. Something to keep in mind as you're using it is this was developed sort of keeping FUI in mind, meaning like interface graphics type of thing, where there's some cool layouts that could be built where people are making different holographic displays and things like that. So a lot of things were thought of in that context. So along those lines, you get some cool detail by shrinking that down. Or we can go larger and overshoot them. We could even overshoot them a whole bunch. If you don't know, you can, on this tick mark on either the right or the left, you can always right click, which will reset it to default, which in this case is 0. So going to return, let me show you that right now we're returning everything. But we can say, you know what, I only want to return the inside, which means that outermost layer disappears. That's always what that does. Inside means the outside goes away. We can click on the outside, and now we only get that box, which of course is just a rectangle, but that will be more interesting in a little bit. Let's go back to full and jump into our next mode. Let's do segment, why not? You'll see visually it doesn't look different at all, but the behavior has changed quite a bit. And that is because if we go to the gap and start increasing that, you'll see that we don't have one giant line going across it, but we've kind of exploded out every place where they cross over each other, and those became separate segments. So with that in mind, the gap becomes a lot more powerful. We can get different separation layering these up, and you get almost like optical illusion where it looks like a circle's in there. And again, this can be set to a 3-dimensional grid. So let's jump this up to 1 cell, and we get some thickness on there, and we can keep on ticking it up and get as many as we want. Let's zero that back down here to get it flat. With segment mode, we are able to separate all those. And keep in mind that, again, we can go negative. In this case, it's not going to look like too much, but you can. And then let's do the inside. And on the inside, we get this nice pattern. But then when you go outside, we get a nice dashed line on the outside. So we can shrink that to whatever degree and get a nice dotted line going around the outside. Let's reset that back to full and get rid of the gap and look at the last mode, which is box mode. Clicking on box, again, it doesn't look any different visually, but instead of a giant line across the entire thing, and instead of individual segments traveling across, every cell is now its own rectangle. So if I increase the gap, you can see that we've got individual boxes shrinking down. Something to keep in mind with the gap is like you could keep on pushing this. We're increasing the gap. You can take the gap and go negative, which would mean they're increasing, and these will begin to overlap each other. So we didn't clamp those values, which of course can create new opportunities. This makes a cool kind of different looking layout. Resetting that back to default, we've got all these different boxes. We could say we only want to see the inside, which will just look like the outer row goes away, which maybe isn't directly useful, but the inverse of it is great, where you click outside, and now we only get this outer shell going. Now, as I talked about, think about this in 2 different ways. There's the 2-dimensional mode and the 3-dimensional mode. Going back to full, let's give this 3 dimensions. So I will increase it up. Let's go up 2. So we get all these different cells. Now, if I say I want to see the inside, that outermost shell goes away. It's kind of like the walls are gone and we only have the interior. But now if I say outside, now we get a hollow box with only the exterior, which is actually pretty powerful. I really like this. It's definitely a functionality I will be using pretty often. Jumping this up to 10, we get something very controllable, and it would be difficult to make this in any other way. So having quick access to it is what makes it powerful and fun to me. Dropping this down to 1. Let me give this a save real quick. So I'll just save this as 6C, why not? And call it Grid Demo. I would like to jump into the next part, which is demoing some cool ways of combining these. But to do that, we want to be able to see the difference between them. So to do that, let's do a little bit of Redshift, but it doesn't matter what renderer you're using. You could use Sketch and Tune or Hair Render or anything, but I think Redshift looks really cool here. So we want to allow this to render in Redshift. I'm going to show you some cool things in Redshift. If you're not doing this workflow, I use it all the time now. So right-clicking on the grid, I would like to add a Redshift object tag on there, and now we can see that we want to render the curve. So I'll say, hey, just render it as a hair. So that should now render in Redshift. To see it, of course, we need to open up our Redshift render view, and I will activate that, and hopefully we should immediately see some sort of grid. Yep, you see the basic grid. We can change the thickness of that if we want. It's pretty big right now, so maybe I will double up the scale. Then, opening up our material manager, I would like to create a Redshift material. Double-clicking on that. Let me drag that over from the other monitor. Keep in mind our renderer is running, so we're not going to get an updated preview here. The renderer can only send it to the render view or it can only send to this preview. So anyway, in this material, keep it nice and simple. In the basic tab, I'd like there to be no color and no reflection. But what I would like there to be is overall some sort of emission, so some luminance. I'll just set it to bright white right now and jump the emission up to 1. So it'll just be 100% luminant. Applying that material, we should see this update. We get a nice white line. What I would like to do is make this way bright. So let's jump this up to 10. So it's 10 times brighter than normal white. So it should really jump out. I've got a reason for that though. And this is something I use all the time in my Redshift workflow. So it's really exciting to share this as a tip. I want to use this material a bunch of different times on different objects and get different results. So let's go into my grid object, go to the basic tab and change the display color from whatever the material is to custom. So now I can set the color on the object. In this case, I'd like to set it to, let's go with a kind of a bright blue. So with that bright blue, I would like that to filter through into the material. How do we do that? Well, let's search for the word user, and there's our color user data. So I can drag that in. That is going to output what attribute? What do we want to look at? Well, I want to look at the object's display color. Several of these work, but I've been using display color and it works well. That also works for things that come from a cloner, if the cloner is colorizing them differently. So having done that, I can click display color. That is now outputting that. What would I like that to drive? If you're not sure what you want to drive, we can select that, and we want to drive the emission weight, which is inside of overall. So let's drag out into the in. That will control overall emission color. The instant I do that, you can see that that's now turned blue. So this is going to look way cool if we get some glows going. So let's close down this material window, and I can collapse that window down because I don't think we need to go into the material again because of the way we've made this. Let's open up the render settings and change this to Redshift. And inside of Redshift, let's set it to advanced. And yeah, I'm going to leave all that default, but let's add in some Redshift post effects. And we can add some bloom in, and we'll pull this down until we can start getting a little bit of glow on there. Something I tend to do, I'm not saying this is a good way to do it, but we can overdo the glow, make it like extra bright. We can even do something like turn on streaks and also hit the threshold there, and you get a little bit of an extra glow on there. You don't want to go too far, just, you know, stylistically do the way you want to. And then I move into exposure, enable that, and via these controls do things like do a crush black threshold, so I can start pulling that down and adding in some crushed black amount. You see I can start pulling back on that. We'll see that be more important later, but it's a good way of kind of controlling how far out the glows go, especially in this kind of FUI type setup where we want something bright and glowing. I think these streaks are probably a little strong, so I'll pull back on those a bit, but let's work from here. Anyway, now we've got one material applied onto this object. Let's go and start making things fancier. I want a second grid. And this time, moving into its parameters, I would like the opposite. I want to see the inside. So that should be just in there. If I change the gap, we can start shrinking that down, and now you can see every individual grid on the inside smaller. Those are the inner ones. But now the cool part about that material is if I go into the basic tab, I can say I would like that to be a darker blue. And now I was able to change the color on just that object without changing anything else. And we can also kind of control how bright that glow is by how bright we make that material. This is now kind of a darker blue, so it doesn't have as much glow. But if we start pulling back and adding a little bit of white in there, it's going to get more and more glow. So we can always pull back on that. We can set this to more of a pink color and have it be more saturated. So now quickly we can start layering up different looks and different effects on this particular grid layout. So I'm actually going to delete that inner one. Actually, no, I won't delete. Let's keep it. But I'm going to change the mode to, let's do just straight up lines. Now, it's currently per step. You know what? I think I might want to set these to endpoints. I'll click it so both go. And now they're smaller and brighter, but I kind of like that. Anyway, with this being smaller, I'm able to set the grid to whatever I want. We're just doing different lines, which should be crisscrossing. So how about I say I want to double the number of lines on this flat grid and don't have any gaps. So those lines should now overshoot all the way to the outside. I want those to be a lot thinner, so I can just select the Redshift tag and say, okay, be half the thickness. And now you can see we get this little inner line going. Now I'll duplicate that again. And now let's say I want an even smaller, more detailed grid. Let's double that again, or let's even triple it. I'm gonna say 60 by 60, and that's all still trapped inside. And now there's so many of those, and they're really bright, so let's make them even thinner. I'm gonna say like 0.2, so those start getting really thin. Actually, this goes even smaller, 0.1. I'm just making this up as I go. You can now see that we've got the secondary inner grid that gives us extra detail on that outer one. And just by layering these up in the scene, we've just got 3 splines. These are just 3 spline objects, but look at all of the stuff that we're getting from it just by beginning to layer those. Pushing this a little bit further. Again, I don't have a plan here. Let's duplicate this middle one. And it'd probably be good to see it in the viewport. Sorry, it's hard to navigate when I'm only doing this on one screen to record. So here is another grid. I'll pull this one up into the air a little bit just so we can see it separately. Let's simplify. Let's make it into a segment, decreasing the cell count down to something a little more simple. Let's say 5 by 5. And I'd like to see the full one so we get that full grid going. And let's make a cloner. In fact, I'll hold down Alt as I create a cloner. So now we are cloning that multiple times. I would like it to clone in a linear way. So it's making copies of it going upward. You can see them all layering up. The cloner is now applying colors to them. So it's overridden and making it white. If we want to, I can say, you know what? It can just be whatever flat color we set here. So I can make those, well, let's make something that looks a little bit better with the ones we got. So you got this kind of super bright glow up on the top. What I'd like to do here next is make a second grid, and this one set it to 1 by 1, and then tell the cloner to blend between them. So cloner, instead of iterating, I'd like to blend between those two sets of parameters. And just to see it, let's turn off these other three. You can now see that we've got a 5 by 5 on the bottom and then only one giant outline on the top. We could push that further. Let's jump this up to, I don't know, 15 by 15. Now we get a bunch of grids down there, and as each step goes upward, let's make more. You can now see that is going to be more complex as it goes from the top down to the bottom. Changing this again, let's change this to, yeah, those are segments, so let's add some gap in there. Jump that up to, I don't know, let's try 15. So yeah, that's going to give us a decent amount of gap there. You can see the gap visually has less of a effect on the top because of the way they're separating, but they transition between them. A lot of ways of starting to layer these up and get some crazy outlines. In fact, let me show you something not that I like on this. I know we're just jumping around, but I'm just having fun with it now. Making a copy of the grid. I'll delete that one. Change it to box mode and set it to a simple 1 by 1 by 1. And now we just get a rectangle. In fact, let's set that to line. We just get a single kind of glowing box. The corners we can, add, or we can overshoot and have them go that way. And we can make as many copies of that as we want. Take that and throw that into a cloner. And again, I'll set it to linear, and I don't want them to offset from each other. And now, again, making a actually, we don't even need to make a duplicate of the grid. Let's just make more copies of it and say that each step will slightly modify. So let's say, you see how I got a series of them spinning there. We can spin more, and each step in this per step, so let's say each one is 90% of the scale of the previous one. And now look at that. Wow, that's pretty cool. And we can add as many, actually, I guess those, this is per step, so we could say endpoint as well. And if this becomes the endpoint, automatically translated for us, and now I can add as many in as I want. We get all these crazy steps. Really bright right now, but again, change the color. Let's go with kind of a bright green and make it a little darker because there's a lot of glow on that. And oh man, like I love the way that these things can start layering up. A seemingly simple tool can start having so much power. Even something as simple as this grid tool that we made, you can see how you can start layering and getting really cool, different finalized effects. Taking this, we can animate the final endpoint, and you can even see the Redshift rendering really quickly there, where you can get these really cool offsets and animations. Like, oh man, like every little frame of that looks really, really neat. So I dig these types of things that you just combine and layer. Now there are additional layouts and things you can do. Let's duplicate that again. Just to show you more combinations, let's put this back to a 2-dimensional grid and go to box mode, and let me start adding additional boxes here. So it's like, okay, now we can get kind of this ladder look, a bunch of straight lines going across, but adding a little bit of gap. You can now see that we get these big fat horizontal lines going, add as many subdivisions as I want there. They'll all layer out. Another cool effect that you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, a grid will do that, but automatically just by tweaking a couple of settings, there we have it, a copy of that. We can change this to segments, and you can see how those will separate exactly 14 units from there to there and between these. And let's go negative on those and let those overshoot. Add as many subdivisions as we want here. So like all sorts of different combinations and different grids you can get. As a spline, there's a lot of different ways that this can be used. Of course, all the different ways splines can be. Let's turn off this render and look at just generating some geometry. First of all, I want to show you something that is important if you want to control a direction. Once again, I can sweep this and feed in a rectangle, which is super huge. You can see, okay, this makes a nice looking grid. These lines will be intersecting each other. That, it just makes sense the way that that's working. But if I were to take this rectangle and add additional height, you're going to see that the lines are actually not facing the same way. It's actually getting taller on different orientations. That's because the sweep wasn't designed to understand these multiple orientations of like exploded separate lines. So just as a hint for you, we could make a duplicate of the grid. So if I make a second one, and I can pull that straight up into the air, and that can now be used as the rail. So inside of the sweep, I will say, I want to use the rail direction right here, but I don't want to use the rail scale. So turning that off, we get the original box shape, but now this knows what direction is up. So they all have the same orientation, meaning selecting the rectangle, I'm able to change the height, and let's grab the width and make it taller. And that carries through and we get a more coherent shape. So just a heads up on that. Something that can be handy along those lines is instead of making a copy of the grid, of course, if you want to make changes, it's easy to select both of them. But something that's better is you can delete that. And while I have this one grid selected, I'll just make where is it? An instance. Put the instance as the child and scoot that up. It gives it a direction. And now I only have to make changes to the one, and the instance will obviously update. So in this case, we can add some extra subdivisions here, and both of them will update, and it still looks good. Pulling that out, another thing to mention, I'll just delete everything. Another thing to mention is this could be fed into something like a volume builder. So here is a volume builder. It's going to be really big right now, but let's say that that should be interpreted with a density of 1 and a radius of, I don't know, say 5. Drop the voxel size to 4. And then turn this into geometry by feeding into a volume mesher. If we get that combination right, then we can actually turn that into geometry. This can be the grid itself. We can make that editable, and you get the raw spline. You can do whatever you want with that. You can explode out the different segments by putting it into a MoGraph fracture object, and have all the different lines explode. Actually, why don't I show you that? Pretty straightforward. Hit undo until it's parametric again. And let's go to box mode. Set it to 5 by 5 by 5. Oop, not 50 by 5. All right, so we got this box. I'll shrink them a little bit so we can see them pop out. We get all this nice internal stuff going on. Actually, let's just say the outside because it looks nice and clean. Feed that into a MoGraph fracture, then explode segments. It won't look any different, but now the fracture can be fed MoGraph effectors, so let's say random, and now all those were able to be exploded outward. Under parameter, we could change the rotation of these, have them all randomly spin. So a lot of fun to be had by exploding out the grid, so we can morph that between. Again, making FUI elements, there's unlimited combinations, and this should hopefully just unlock new opportunities to do things that maybe you could do before, but it took a while to build those individual rigs. But I think for the most part, this is covering everything I want to show that it could do. There's more. Like I said, if you have ideas, please let me know of like 2.0 features. We are working on some additional splines in the future, so keep an eye out for those. And just to show you for fun, I guess I didn't show you, but you can go into your nodes layout and you can drag this in as a node as well. Let me go to my custom layout so I can actually see the assets browser easily. So searching for the grid, I can drag that in here, and you can use it directly as an object inside of the scene nodes. Just to show you, even though this seems like a simple tool, I want to show you that, let's go to startup layout. I'm going to show, here's the grid, but in it's more raw state. And if I go inside of it, here are the individual nodes that are making it up. So you can see that even though it seems like a relatively simple tool, this is like the code that goes into it. Like, we've got all these different nodes doing all this math, interconnecting with each other, controlling the different modes, controlling the different combinations. So you can see that there's a lot of stuff that goes into making something even as simple as this. So hopefully you can have fun with it and make some cool looking things. If you do make anything cool, make sure you tag me at Rocket Lasso on all the different things. So that wraps this up. Keep an eye out for additional things we're going to be making for Maxon. Keep an eye out for our own tools that we'll be releasing, and keep an eye out for Season 4 of Rocket Lasso Live, which will be coming out in a month or so. But that should wrap this up. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video or tutorial in the future. Bye-bye.